What is going on, y'all? KMBest here, your favorite neither 67th nor 69th ranked Marvel Snapper. Let's talk about the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. I don't think it should surprise anyone that we're starting with Shoucasta for two major reasons. For the more media savvy among you, this is also the deck that I did a video on just yesterday. And for the more observant among you, perhaps you might have noticed that Shou-Lao is the remaining unnerfed card from the trifecta of Gambit, Shou-Lao, and of course Star-Lord, Master of the Sun. This means that Shou-Lao is naturally going to take a little bit of a rise up the ranks as its two biggest contenders and two decks that mostly felt like they could bully Shou-Lao have been nerfed, which leaves Shou-Lao putting on the role of a metagame bully. This list is probably the least reliant on Shou-Lao of any Shou-Lao list, but it is still, of course, a deck that has a lot of the power of Shou-Lao wrapped up in it. Being a Jocasta deck means that you have nut draws that do not even involve the card Shou-Lao, and that's fine, but a lot of your nut draws still do. The good news is you don't have to go very far off curve in order to get access to those Jocasta draws. I've received a couple of questions about this deck that I think are probably going to be informative in answering, so I'm going to phrase the next part of this video as a Q&A session. Question number one. When do you play a 1-drop on turn 1? The answer is basically never unless you have a Merlin in hand. You are almost always going to want to defer for a 1+1 on turn 2. You could also play those 1-drops on 1 with a Kitty Pryde. For example, play the Kitty Pryde on 1, Kitty Pryde +1. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule necessarily as you get further up the curve. Once you get to like turn 3, suddenly you're like, okay, I could prioritize my Shou-Lao, or I could play a Jocasta now, and often playing the Jocasta on 3 is worth going off curve for the Shou-Lao. The rest of the time, you're gonna want to be focusing on the Shou-Lao. Question number 2. What should Prodigy be doing when he's not copying a Jocasta? Well, usually the answer is just kind of whatever, but the major thing that I like that he can do is copy things like Maverick while also passing on Maverick buffs. One of the things that will get you when you play a deck like this is that you're probably going to be a little bit too greedy with it a lot of the time. You'll be like, oh, I have to save this. Oh, I have to save this. I can't play Maverick now. What if I don't draw Scarlet Spider so I have a Shou-Lao payoff? But it's like, a lot of the time you're going to have to do that, and Prodigy is a card who can bail you out of those situations. Oh, I had to play my Maverick really early, but it's okay. I get to Prodigy my Maverick and actually give the first Maverick's buff to my second Maverick, which is what Prodigy is. That is what allows Prodigy to have a lot of the power that he does. You can even do lines where you set up for him to copy a turn 5 Shou-Lao. I don't particularly advise these lines because they typically end up putting a lot of your power on the board, but it is the kind of thing that you can very reasonably do. This is a deck that also you will want to pay attention to when you are firing off your big lasers or activating your Jocastas. You do not need to be super greedy in a lot of matchups about the combo aspects of this deck. You are able to be a lot less greedy and a lot less blown out by something like a Cosmic Ghost Rider if you are simply just playing it straightforwardly and relying on Shou-Lao to take you over the top of other mid-range decks. You don't need a full combo to beat those guys. You kind of just need one good Shou-Lao proc. And that means that you can be a lot less vulnerable to the guys that are going to be able to counter you if you aren't greedy with your activates. I'm not saying that you always need to be firing them off, but what I am saying is a lot of people will play a deck like this and never fire their stuff before turn 6, and that is wrong. This alternate Shou-Lao build comes from Ika. I've quite enjoyed it just as a weird little thing to mess around with. That isn't so particularly specific in terms of what it's trying to do with Shou-Lao. This is more like a good cards deck that has Shou-Lao stuff in it. You get, of course, Iska doubles off of Shou-Lao stuff, which can be a particularly powerful thing to do. Viv Vision is a card that has synergy not just with Iska and Maverick, but also with Agony and sometimes Nico Minoru. Surge as a sort of pseudo buff and discount card, particularly useful. You do lose out on Merlin because you are sort of forced forced by the fact that you are a Maverick-only version of Shou-Lao to run Kate Bishop instead, so you make sure you have enough ones in order to make the Maverick with the Shou-Lao buff actually hit something. But between Cosmo and Stardust, you actually have a good amount of interaction here. This is a very safe Shou-Lao list, just a lot of good cards with some powerful, proactive onboard interaction. You run into Doom 2099, Stardust is obviously great. You run into things that are trying to abuse on reveals. You have Cosmo for that, and then just generally a lot of stats to back that kind of stuff up. It's a very solid way to play Marvel Snap. From here, everything gets really, really weird, because other than Shou-Lao, I'm not sure what else is meaningfully distinguishing itself from the gamut of very playable but not particularly special decks. So you have a metagame that is in its very early stages of forming, and Shou-Lao, being a deck that is already put together, is a natural frontrunner in those situations. This means that there are decks like this that are still going to be good and powerful and proactive as long as people aren't specifically building for them. One of the best places to be in a metagame where one deck is starting to increase its distance from the pack, which is how I feel about Shou-Lao right now, and specifically the Activate version of Shou-Lao, is to just play a list that is pretty good into that stuff and also has a bunch of points. Doom 2099 has a bunch of points. It is pretty good into Activate stuff because most people are still being too greedy in the face of Cosmic Ghost Rider, and most Shou-Lao decks do not have great answers to their Shou-Lao plan being turned off by Sandman. The 2/5s here are pretty key to that matchup. They are very, very important in making sure you're able to win that matchup. And then the rest of this deck is just really, really efficient stats all the way up the curve. From the 2s, which are both going to be like 2/6, 2/8, 2/10, extremely large, to the 3s, Invisible Woman First Steps, which is definitely going to hit multiple things, ideally a Moondragon and maybe an Iska or a Doom 2099. Excellent to have multiple procs of that. Drax is the single best stats 3, and Caliban is probably the second best in a context like this. Iska, of course, as good as it gets. Doom 2099, the centerpiece of the deck. And, of course, your draw for more hits. This is a deck that plays a lot of amazing targets for an Iron Lad. We already talked about the 2/5s. That's where your tech cards live. And at 6, you have the 2 best go-wide 6-drops in the game. Tons of power in this deck. A lot of your cube equity is going to depend on those 5s because they're the only parts where you're actually going to ever surprise somebody or take them off their game plan. The rest of the time, you're just going power for power. But this deck does power very well. Another deck that meaningfully mixes power with tech is the Jay Wallace Cerebro list, which is alternately extremely powerful and extremely fragile. Weirdly, the thing I've found about Cerebro recently is that it's actually just a very difficult deck to play without a great mental game. And I knew this, but also I've been playing a lot more of the deck recently, and boy, my mental game is shot. This is a deck that is going to lose not just to locations and things of that nature, but to like decisions you make, right? You'll run into a deck like this, you'll be like, well, I'm not playing Luke Cage, so there are more locations that beat me. You'll lose to that, or you'll win, and maybe you'll put a Luke Cage in there, and then you'll be like, but in order to fit the Luke Cage in there, I've given up further things. I'm highlighting this specific build of Cerebro because I want to drive home a very important point. The nerf to Gambit seems to actually have mattered quite a bit, especially in the context of decks like this. I was worried it would make this show up in Cerebro more, but the more I play this list, the less my Gambit seems to be active unless I'm drawing particularly relevant things. The big reason for this is that you got taken off of a couple of really powerful lines when Gambit went to 6. The first one of those lines is play a 2, play a 3, play a Bastion on that lane. That's normally 5, but it's not 5 anymore. That needs another thing to supplement it, and it's very hard to get that other thing to supplement it. Obviously, when you're doing something like when your 3 is something like Gambit or Cerebro that you're really happy to copy, yeah, that's great, but you need Frigga and Bastion then, or Bastion and a Sentinel then. And it's like, oh, okay, that's actually a lot harder to make happen than you might think. I do still think this is the right direction for the list to go, but it is entirely possible that Gambit himself isn't particularly amazing. Part of what's going on here is the inclusion of Quinjet and Magus, who can copy a Quinjet sometimes, in order to enable you to make sure you are actually playing all of those copied cards. The power output of this list is very, very high. It has a ton of things going for it. And as always, the thing going against Rebro is Rebro. You're just going to lose sometimes. The safest Gambit deck for you to play is Lee Hand, and having multiple Gambits is a particularly powerful thing to do in a world where people are playing a lot of Shou-Lao. But one of the things that distinguishes the Shou-Lao decks at the beginning of this video from previous iterations of Shou-Lao decks is just simply that they have more large guys in them. Like the Jocasta package means that you can justify running Scarlet Spider. It means you can justify running things like Omega Sentinel that are still going to be able to go power to power with you. And a lot of the time when you're going all in on Gambits in a list like this, which is kind of what you want to do in the Shou-Lao matchup, you might not have a ton of power to begin with. These are the kind of matchups where I think a lot of better versions or better players on the Jocasta list that are actually getting their value before their stuff gets gambited. That kind of dynamic, understanding the pressure you're under, understanding how many cards your opponent can play that cost X amount, and when those gambits are going to trigger. A lot of the time when you're playing this deck, you want your gambits to trigger on 5 against those Shou-Lao lists, because if they trigger at the end of the game, well, a lot of the time they're going to have a bunch of spiders or a large amount of negative power on you. And it's like, okay, well, I didn't actually trigger all my stuff. There are, of course, going to be the normal games where they're like doing Maverick stuff or whatever. And it's like, okay, well, they're doing Maverick stuff. I'm just going to play 3 gambits. The game's going to end when I blow up 12 energy worth of stuff and I'll be fine. That still happens, but there's a lot more inbuilt ability for those decks to play around that because of the relatively higher curves in them. That is an adaptation that Gambit has forced. I still do think this is probably the best way to play Gambit, because this is the list that has the most efficient actual activations of the card. I think that it also maintains a better ability to go tall than the versions that play the Hood and Misery, but I totally understand why you might choose to do something else. Red Guardian is a pure flex slot here. He's just here to be here. We have an opening for a tech card. The metagame is too wide for me to have a specific call out like Cosmo or Mobius, so we're just doing this. Another really safe Gambit deck is Arishem. Arishem typically spikes early in metagames before things get figured out. You just have a bunch of tech cards here that you just like deploy at will, and then the rest of what you're doing is just, I would like a bunch of stats, please. Gambit is really important to lists like this. Like against certain matchups, you're just going to be overwhelmingly favored because of what Gambit represents for you, which is effectively a free proc. You're already playing all the cards that work really well with Gambit. You have all of these things that stomp on decks that are either comboing over the top of you like Supergiant and Stardust, or trying to stay below you with scalers like Gambit and Man-Thing. If Arishem wasn't Arishem, I'd call this deck broken, but as is, I think it's just pretty good. This is one of the better constructed versions of Arishem that I've ever seen. Great lane winners, great invalidators. That's really what Arishem has become. This is a deck that is outside of the 2-drop spot, entirely composed of decks that, or cards that are meant to greatly invalidate what your opponent is doing, all the way from Gambit up to Fin Fang Foom. The entire premise is what you're doing didn't matter, what I'm doing does. That is why, actually, what you're doing didn't matter. I want to talk a little bit about both the Rocks deck and the Supergiant deck here, because I think they're pretty similar. The Supergiant deck is a deck that strikes fear into nobody's heart, despite being a very powerful thing to do. From Smiz, we have an Ozymandias version of Supergiant that I think is a particularly compelling direction for the list to take because of the power it has access to, but it will also one of the coolest things about Supergiant lists is how hard it is for your opponents to understand what's going on and how many turn sixes you get to play. And for me, I think I consider that like a really meaningful upside. But when you look at what this list is doing, it is playing the absolute minimum amount of Ozymandias targets. It's actually closer to just a Supergiant list that has recognized that, oh, wait, playing Debris and playing things like Herbie, who can be like a 2/6 or a 2/7 or Rhino, that's actually just something I want to do as a Supergiant deck, and then I'm going to chuck in Ozymandias because Ozymandias is just pretty good. If you make the comparison to the Ronin package, Ronin is, of course, Ozymandias, Rhino and Debris are Maximus and Master Mold, and you can see why it might be a little bit preferable to go this direction, even if the guy you're getting at the 5-drop payoff isn't as big. That is basically the premise here. Very solid Supergiant list. Everything you expect from a Supergiant list, just a slightly different package, supplementing it, the Rock package instead of the Clog Your Opponent's Hand package. The other Supergiant list I kind of like is this one, which is a full Snowball Stats Supergiant list. This is an unbelievably fair deck. Like, one of the things that I really appreciated about Supergiant, and I think I get to appreciate it even more as things develop in this direction, is that Supergiant is the thing that keeps extremely fair Marvel Snap around. Like, if it weren't for Supergiant, everyone would be like fusing a little bit of combo stuff into their decks. As is, Supergiant is meaningful counterplay against so many of these combo decks. It's meaningful counterplay against so many different things that really want to do something incredibly specific on 5. It's meaningful counterplay against so many different things that really want to have a Limbo or something like that available to them, because if they really want to play that magic on 5, so we don't have as many turns to react to it, things like that. It's meaningful counterplay against anyone who's still doing Star-Lord stuff. It's meaningful counterplay. Oh, you're Mr. Negative? No, Jane Foster. Oh, you're a Sarah deck looking to discount stuff for the Living Tribunal? No, you're not. There are just so many combo decks that really care about what Supergiant is taking away, and those combo decks usually care even more about what Supergiant gives you the ability to take away going into the turn after that, which is typically priority. One of the things about combo decks is they're typically giving up early presence in exchange for overpowering late games. Supergiant attacks that on multiple levels. First, it scales off of having early presence. You want that early presence so you can get your Iron Patriot, your Viv Vision, your extra stats, and you want to lock that in on 4 before they can actually start doing their explosive endgame, because then their explosive endgame gets shut down by Cosmo and Negasonic. That is the basic premise of Supergiant, and it is what is keeping fair stats alive in Marvel Snap. I mean, you could also trade to describe Ramp as fair stats. I think that's like a reasonable enough supposition. This is about the fairest of the big boy decks that you're going to get, but it is still a deck that plays Fin Fang Foom and a lot of big guys, and you can just go really tall in one lane and then play a Fin Fang Foom in another, and that is a very compelling thing to do. And as long as you have access to that play line, you're going to be doing something at least particularly reasonable. This is a classic deck that has existed in Marvel Snap for a while. It's proactive in powerful ways. You have access to anti-location tech in the form of Legion and Cosmic Ghost Rider to shut down some of the combo decks, much like how you have in the Doom 2099 deck, Sandman and CGR. The 5s are where the cube equity comes from in this list. Downside is it's perhaps even more predictable than Doom 2099, because at least with Doom 2099, there's some ambiguity as to where the power is going off those Doom bots, whether it's going to be a Dr. Doom or an Aurora. This deck is basically always locking in playing one thing per turn, and if you play one thing per turn, well, they're playing around a Fin Fang Foom. You don't have anything bigger than Fin Fang Foom, so any deviation you take, they've already played around it because they're staying if they're going to beat a Fin Fang Foom. So you're probably not going to be in a good spot if your opponents are confident into you. That is what knocks Ramp down the tier list. It's a very solid deck, but it is unfortunately deeply predictable. I've been seeing some, let's say, signs of life from Star-Lord recently, like some versions of the deck that are just gonna be playing things like a turn 4 Star-Lord off of a Psylocke on 3, which is like, okay, I'm getting 3 energy off the Star-Lord, I'm Zolaing the Star-Lord. That's basically the old plan. That's awesome. It does work. Like, that is an actual thing you can do. It just means that those versions of the deck are a little bit more hard up when that kind of stuff isn't happening. They're still very much built around Star-Lord. Why I'm showing you this one instead is because I think this one is A, a little less built around Star-Lord, and B, can set up in oblique ways to win with and without the card, but still benefits extremely heavily from the inclusion of Star-Lord. And let's say you have a Kid Omega and a Firehair on the board, you play a Star-Lord, right? Like that kind of stuff. You activate the Kid Omega on the Star-Lord, you get a bunch of power, you get a second Star-Lord proc off the Firehair, you get a bunch of power. That kind of stuff is really powerful. The other card I want to highlight in Star-Lord decks that I think is now undeniably a card you're going to have to play, that is Wave. And there are two reasons for that. The first is, of course, if you Wave on 3 and then you play Star-Lord on 4, you're only getting 2 energy, but 2 energy going into turn 5 is still enough to Zola. You Zola, you're getting 3/3 off of that. That's good enough. Obviously, that doesn't apply to this version of Star-Lord, but it does apply to the one that is still playing the old Star-Lord deck, but with Psylocke jammed in. In this version, instead of playing Zola, you're doing fastball adamantium, right? Same concept, though, where it's just like, I'm going to get something out of this. I'm going home with something. It's not great. The other thing you can do is play Wave on 4 and then Star-Lord on 5, which will get you 5 energy off of the Star-Lord. And that kind of thing, like assuming you skip reasonably on the previous turns, is actually still valuable enough to do some real damage in a context like this. Like you can do a lot of really powerful stuff. And so I think that largely what you're looking at with a deck like this is trying to find a way to maximize Star-Lord value, maximize points output, but this is a deck that can do some points regardless. You just do something stupid. It doesn't matter what that thing specifically is, you just gotta get to something stupid. Is it Wave on 3, Star-Lord on 4, Misery the Star-Lord on 5 while playing a Firehair? Yeah, sure, why not? Just do something. And I think a lot of the premise of this deck is just figuring out some kind of way to do something vaguely ridiculous. You're going to have a lot of energy and then just combo them off and figure it out. It's a very non-prescriptive deck where you're kind of ad-libbing through your combo the entire time, which is a unique experience at Marvel Snap. It's almost like, do you know the Magic the Gathering deck Eggs? It's a little like that. Well, now that, of course, my guy Star-Lord has been nerfed, we are back on Denish Hela a little bit. And I think that's a really interesting, obviously the MODOK Hela stuff probably gone. We're back on Fair Hela. It's early in a metagame. There's a lot of upside in doing something like this. Like we've talked about how people are just like actually playing ramp decks. We talked about how people are actually playing 2099. People are actually playing Arishem. You're going to make them look stupid if they don't Stardust you. You're going to make them look really, really, really stupid. You're going to make a lot of decks look really stupid if they don't Stardust you. This is just classic Denish style Hela. It is meant to do something vaguely ridiculous, but Hela is, of course, the base game plan here, and Hela just is enough points to beat a lot of stuff right now. Like this package with the upgrade that Fin Fang Foom provided in January has consistently done pretty notable output. You're going to be a little bit, well, a lot smaller, I would say, than the Star-Lord versions of the deck, but you also just are going to be playing better cards most of the time and are going to be more able to do things like YOLO Gambit, and you're going to be able to actually try to interact slightly more with your opponent, the Gambit, the Corvus, the setups for Odin lanes. You just cheat some guys onto the board, and that is unfortunately just going to be good enough. En Sabanur is almost like a fusion between the versions of, I would say this is kind of like a fusion of Ramp and Hela, or maybe it's a fusion of Doom 2099 and Hela, because what it's doing is it's saying, here are my incredibly efficient bodies early on the curve. And then late in the curve, you're just like, I'm cheating. I'm cheating something onto the board. I'm playing Jubilee Blink. I'm getting something off the Jubilee. I'm getting something off the Blink. I'm cheating, right? I'm playing En Sabanur, and then I'm playing Jubilee. I'm flushing the Jubilee in. I get something off the Jubilee. I'm cheating, right? Like that's kind of the whole premise of the late game here. And of course, much like everything else in the big boys space, you are still playing Cosmic Ghost Rider. That is your only tech card. It is the tech card of all tech cards, but really this is a points list, right? Where Hela is entirely unfair output and Ramp is roughly entirely fair output, this is a deck that is half fair output and half unfair output, or a fair output deck with an unfair output package in it. Largely, I would guess that the more you play against unfair output decks, the worse this deck gets. And the more you play against fair output decks, the better this deck gets. Because what matters in a metagame is not having the highest point total. It's having like one more point on average than everyone else you play against. You don't need to win by 1 billion, you just need to win. And so this deck is sort of built to be an influx of unfairness in a metagame of fair decks. If that's what you're seeing, it's a very reasonable choice to complete those ESN weekend missions. Last up, a couple decks from high-ranking players. Here is Derek's deck, which is also every Derek deck ever. Perhaps the most Cosmo Juggernaut deck of all time. The idea here is basically skip 1, play a 1-on-2. That makes Star-Lord into a target that discounts your Scar, because he will have 10 power. Getting that extra energy means that you have access to things like a 4 and a 4 on the final turn of the game, Negasonic Juggernaut, or a 10 and a Negasonic, or a 10 and a Juggernaut. All sorts of ridiculous stuff. Stats, Juggernaut, Negasonic. You know the drill here. Like, you might look at this and be like, oh, interesting Scar deck. Not a Scar deck. Not even close to a Scar deck. This is a Juggernaut Cosmo deck. That's what this deck actually is. The other stuff is just like, oh, here's the point package in my Juggernaut Cosmo deck. That's what's going on here, though. Another incredible piece of good player deck building is Honithors' version of the Thor list. This is purely output, purely just where are my points going. It is every werewolf deck that has ever existed. I do think it's a particularly interesting way to play Thors. I've also seen some pixie lists that are particularly compelling, but this is the one I have the most experience playing with and against, and it does some pretty reasonable and powerful stuff. If you are playing against something that is truly comboing off, you don't necessarily want to see this, but there aren't a ton of decks in this metagame that are truly comboing off. I've actually been quite disappointed with the lack of Man Spider and Mr. Negative that I've seen on the ladder. Like, Bullseye QWERTY sent me a negative Man Spider deck, and I'm like, that looks cool. I haven't seen a single person play it. Derek sent me a version as well that was like doing weird stuff in that space too, and I was like, you know, I bet this would be good, but I can't put it on the tier list in good faith because you're the only person that plays this. Like, it's cool, and I think there's probably room to attack the metagame that way, but every time I actually go and look it up and go check and see how well Man Spider's doing on any of the stats websites I look at, and I'm just like, man, that deck just doesn't have a good enough plan A. And that's sort of the thing that I run into with those decks is you're like, okay, when I do my combo, I'm winning, but part of what made negative Star-Lord so special is that it did its combo more. And now that that's not a part of the archetype, it's like, well, I guess I'm just limping a lot more. That's a really big loss. It's the biggest possible loss for a deck like that to double the amount of things that actually make it win the game. And now to lose that and go back to what it used to be, it's pretty difficult. And I think that might have happened to both of those decks, or we haven't gotten to the right version of like a Fallen One Man Spider deck, or Fallen One Man Spider is just sort of fundamentally flawed for being too telegraphed. Haven't figured it out. Largely, though, what I'm saying is in a different metagame where those decks were like meaningfully existent, I would be talking about how this deck is just doing basically nothing, right? Because if you run into any of those matchups, you're deads. You do have I will say, if you're going to run into Man Spider, you do have a Shadow King. But you kind of get what I'm saying. Like, you're running into, like, Tribunal, which I haven't seen any of. You're running into Mr. Negative. I have basically seen none of. That is a very impossible to win matchup. And instead, we're in a metagame where it doesn't seem like a lot of people are playing that. A lot of people are playing fair stats decks, and you can absolutely leverage the fact that, like, your opponent's playing Doom 2099 or Ramp, and you just kind of know where all their points are going to be, and so you can just play to beat that. And that's really what this deck is about. It's about final turn point allocation, and that's it. And if you're good at that, feel free. This is basically a bounce deck. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. And I will see you in the next one.